Hi everybody, welcome to today's webinar brought to you by the Parent Engagement Network. It's titled Authentic Engagement, the Nature and Role of the Relationship at the Heart of Effective Practice. My name is Barbara Barker and I'm the Project Manager here at ARACY working on parent engagement. Before I start, I'd just like to note that this webinar is reaching across the more than 500 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nations that make up contemporary Australia. We would therefore like to acknowledge the traditional owners of all those countries and pay our respects to their elders, past, present and future. Wherever you are in Australia today, you may wish to make your own acknowledgement of country to the traditional owners and elders of the land on which you are currently standing. Today we'll be hearing from Dr. Tim Moore. Tim is a developmental psychologist who heads a research and policy team at the Centre for Community Child Health, a department of the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne and a research group of MCRI. Dr. Moore's team has responsibility for monitoring, reviewing and synthesising research literature on a wide range of topics relating to child development, family functioning and service systems. A frequent speaker at conferences and seminars, Dr. Moore is a lead writer on many of the Centre's reports, conference papers and policy briefs, and develops training and resource packages for early childhood and family support services. He has also taken a leading role nationally in the development of policy and training in the early childhood intervention field. His work has had a significant impact on practice and policy in the early childhood intervention and early childhood fields, both nationally and internationally. Dr. Moore was lead author on a recently released evidence paper that highlighted the astonishing rates of child development from conception to the end of age 2 years and the benefit of a holistic approach to children's health called The First 1,000 Days. Tim is also a founding member of Early Childhood Intervention Australia, ECIA, Victorian chapter, and served as its president for 10 years. Tim has convened numerous ECIA state and national conferences, has taken a leading role in the development of policy and training in the early childhood intervention field, and continues to be involved in ECIA Vic activities as a member of the Committee of Management. We're very pleased to present Tim to you today. Over to you, Tim.
Thank you, Barbara, and welcome to everyone online. I hope you can now see the screen. I'm going to be talking to you today about authentic engagement and the nature of the relationship at the heart of effective practice. This paper was originally given at the ARACY conference earlier this year, which was specifically devoted to the question of parent engagement in support of children's learning. But in fact, we can seek to engage parents for many reasons. We can help parents with personal or parenting problems. We can help them support their children's learning. We can help groups of parents manage issues that they share. We can help communities of parents in addressing common concerns regarding services or environments, or we can collaborate with parents in co-designing, co-managing and co-evaluating services. My argument is that to be successful, all of these different forms of engagement depend upon the nature of the relationships that are established between the professionals and the parents. And that's my focus in this presentation. So what we're going to be looking at is some evidence regarding the role and nature of relationships. I'm going to look at the neurobiology of interpersonal relations and then look at some key features of effective relationships, some challenges in authentic engagement and some conclusions. So spend about half the time on the evidence and the neurobiology and half on the features of effective relationships and challenges. So let's begin with this role and nature of relationships. In my work, my job consists of trying to synthesize that knowledge. And these are the kinds of books that I get to read. Two important ones are those two in the middle at the top, Louis Cozolino's book on the neuroscience of human relationships, and Matthew Lieberman on social, why our brains are wired to connect. Let's see what they have to tell us. Lieberman says our brains are designed to respond to and be influenced by others. We are wired to be social. And our brain has a network devoted to mind reading others. We have an unparalleled ability to understand actions and thoughts of those around us, enhancing our ability to stay connected and to interact strategically with one another. In fact, when we experience threats or damage to our social bonds, the brain actually responds in much the same way as it does to physical pain. So when we use the language in relationships of being hurt by someone or of having a broken heart or something, we're often using languages that echo that theme that is actually painful. And that's because in the brain, it's actually responding in exactly the same way as we respond to pain. Now, all of this comes from new understandings about brain functioning. So I'm going to say something, first of all, about how our brains operate. And I'm drawing on the work here of Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize for this work on thinking fast and slow, two modes of thinking. We have two systems in our brains. He calls them System 1 and System 2. System 1 operates automatically and quickly with little or no effort, no sense of voluntary control, and it generates the sense that is the main source of the beliefs and deliberate choices of System 2. So System 1 is an automatic, very fast system that shapes our thinking. System 2 is a more deliberate and slow system, only used when the situation demands it and generates the subjective experience that we have agency, we have choice, we are concentrating on this thing. So that's our conscious mind. These two systems lend themselves to whimsical pictures like this. But I must confess it always conjures up for me Dr. Seuss and Thing 1 and Thing 2. But the critical thing here is that paralleling this process, these two processes for thinking, are two modes of interpersonal communication. So we've got two parallel pathways for processing conscious and unconscious information that is exchanged between us. And the first is this early evolving fast set that we share with other animals, and they're non-verbal and it's inaccessible to conscious reflection. And using that system, our brains constantly communicate with other people's brains via subconscious high-speed pathways. The second mode of interpersonal communication is a slower system, and it involves conscious awareness, and that gives rise to narratives and stories and imagination and abstract thought and conscious communication between one another through speech. The difference in processing speed between these fast and slow systems is considerable, at least from a neurological point of view. It's approximately 1/2 second. While it takes 500 to 600 milliseconds for brain activity to register in conscious awareness, our brains process sensory, motor, and emotional information much faster, in 10 to 50 milliseconds, almost instantaneously. So there's a 1/2 second difference. And during this 1/2 second, our brains work like search engines. What's happening is that we are unconsciously scanning our memories, our bodily reactions, and our emotions for relevant information about what we've just registered. And we construct our present experience based on a template from the past. We think of this as being objective reality. The critical thing here is by the time you become consciously aware of an experience, it's already been processed. It's activated memories, it's initiated complex patterns of behavior. And so that 90% of the input to the cortex, the thinking part of your brain, actually comes from this internal neuroprocessing rather than the outside world. So the critical thing to take on board here is that we've got this system that connects us through very fast mechanisms unconsciously, and that we are registering whether we know it or not. Louis Cozolino talks about this in terms of a social synapse. You perhaps be familiar with the notion of a synapse, which is the connection between neurons in the brain. In fact, they don't touch. There's a small gap between them, and the messages are transferred not through direct contact. Well, Cozolino is suggesting the same thing happens with us. The social synapse is the space between us, a space that is filled with seen and unseen messages through which we are combined into larger organisms such as families and tribes and society. And because our experience as individual selves is lived at the border of this synapse, and because so much of this communication occurs below conscious awareness, it's mostly invisible to us. We're not aware that it's happening. But what's happening is that when we smile and wave and say hello, and those behaviors are sent through the space between us via sight and sound, and these messages are received by our senses, and they're converted into electrochemical signals within our nervous system. They're sent to our brain, and they generate chemical changes and electrical activation and new behaviors, which in turn transmit messages back across the social synapse, all without us knowing that this is going on. We are communicating with one another through these fast processes without realizing it's going on. So these subconscious pathways enable our brains to read the body and facial signals of others and to detect their intentions and emotional states. How do we do it? We read facial expressions, pupil dilation. Your pupils dilate when you see someone that you're very fond of. Your posture gives away some of your attitude, your tone of voice, even your smells and mirror neuron systems. All of these are the mechanisms that allow our brains to communicate unconsciously at top speed. Our eyes and other people's eyes are the pathways to what it is that they're thinking. In effect, our right brains are able to communicate directly with other people's right brains, independent of conscious communication processes or awareness. And the right limbic system, the limbic system is this midbrain system that enables all this to occur, grows rapidly in the first 2 years of life, and the nature of the development of that system can have long-term implications throughout the life. When we try to draw it, we end up with rather inelegant pictures like this of all the communication going backwards and forwards between an infant and a mother, although that still occurs between adults. I rather like this one. This is two brains seen from on top. They're facing each other. They're wired up, and what you see how those brains are lighting up when they're actually copying each other. You can see it's right brain to right brain, backwards and forwards at top speed. Now, the significance of all of this has to do with the nature of our relationships. That those super fast connections are occurring and affect the quality of all the relationships we have. And insights regarding the importance of these interpersonal relationship processes come from a whole variety of sources. So we can learn from lessons from vulnerable families, from looking at psychotherapy, efficacy, from research on effective help-giving practices, research on family-centred practice and family-centred care, on family partnership training and community practice, and on co-design and production. So one of the ways in which I've tried to tackle this is to look at all the evidence from those different sources to see whether they are telling us what's the importance of relationships in all of this. The neurobiology evidence would clearly suggest that relationships are important. Do we have other evidence to indicate this? We don't have time to go through all of this. I'll look briefly at some of the things that we've looked at. Let's just take what we've learned from working with marginalised and vulnerable families. And this comes from one of our policy briefs that we've produced. What this suggests is that what vulnerable and marginalised families need are services that do these things: help them feel valued and understood, and that are non-judgmental and honest, have respect for their inherent human dignity, responsive to their needs rather than prescriptive, allow them to feel in control, help them feel capable, competent and empowered, are practical and help them meet their self-defined needs, are timely, providing help when they feel they need it, not weeks or months or even years later, and provide continuity of care. Parents really value the sense of security from having a long-term relationship with the same service provider. Now, what's striking to me about that list is that most of it is in fact about relationships. This is what vulnerable and marginalised families say is what they value most about services: the relationship side of it, the feeling valued and understood. And the feeling of valued and being understood comes not only from what the practitioner says, but how they relate to people. The neurobiology of our relationships tells us that the communication that is occurring unconsciously is communicating to the particular family whether this person genuinely values and understands them, whether they are genuinely being non-judgmental and honest and respectful. So it's at that unconscious level that much of the important relationship building side of things is playing out. What about psychotherapy? In the psychotherapy literature, we have an approach called the common factors approach, which suggests that the reason that psychotherapy works is not because of the unique contributions of any particular model of intervention, but because of a set of common factors or mechanisms of change that cut across all effective therapies. All therapies work, in fact. They work with, and they don't work with everyone, but all of them are effective. But the two main factors that contribute to them being effective is the therapeutic alliance, that is the joint working relationship between the therapist and client, and the personal qualities of the therapists themselves. These are the common factors that determine the efficacy of psychotherapy. So again, we've got the theme coming out that it is the personal qualities that underpin the relationships that are important to effective practice. One of my favorite illustrations of this comes from this particular study, which was a randomized controlled trial of a drug for depression, which found that the drug was significantly more beneficial than a placebo, that is, using just a sugar pill. However, who saw the patient rather than what they prescribed was even more important. So some psychiatrists who were administering the drug were consistently more effective than others, regardless of whether they were prescribing the drug or the placebo. In fact, when they divided the top third best performing psychiatrists and compared them with the bottom third, they found that the top third achieved better outcomes using the placebo than the bottom third did using the drug. An astonishing finding. And the authors conclude that we should consider that the psychiatrist is not only a provider of treatment, but also a means of treatment. I think that's a very important lesson for us to take away. Another set of evidence that we've looked at concerns beliefs. Both parent and professional beliefs play an important mediating role in achieving positive outcomes. And of course, beliefs are unconscious. They are things that communicate between us without us necessarily having to be explicit about them. The parental beliefs that matter is that the belief in the intervention plan, which is in fact a placebo effect. In other words, the parent has to believe that the plan that they've agreed on is going to work, and they have to believe in their ability to implement the intervention as planned. The professionals also have beliefs which contribute to the efficacy. They have to believe in the efficacy of the intervention also, and they have to believe in the parent's ability to implement the plan. And the important thing here to understand is that their belief in the parent's ability is communicated in a non-verbal fashion. It's communicated through these fast channels that enable the genuine intentions of the service provider to be communicated directly and read directly by the recipient. The other thing that that we've learned is that parallel processes matter. This is a term borrowed from the mental health field, and what it tells us is that all relationships affect other relationships. Parallel processes operate at all levels of the chain and relationships. So our capacity to relate to others is supported or undermined by the quality of our own support relationships. There's a flow-on effect that can be seen in the relationships between, say, early childhood professionals and parents of young children. We model for parents how to relate to their young children by the way we relate to them. And relationships form a cascade of parallel processes so that the quality of relationships at one level shapes the quality. So it works like this. People learn how to be with others by experiencing how others are with them. This is how your views and feelings of relationships are formed. Therefore, how parents are with their babies, and we want them to be warm and sensitive and responsive and consistent and available, is as important as what they do. We want them to be able to feed and change and soothe and protect and teach them. Similarly, how professionals are with parents, respectful, attentive, consistent, available, is as important as what they do. Inform, support, guide, refer, counsel. Very important message. How we are with our clients and so on is as important as what we do with them. So the bottom line here, if we have a look at all of this evidence about the importance of relationships and the role that the neurobiology plays in this, is that how services are delivered is as important as what is delivered. Outcomes are not simply the result of advice, such as take drug X or play with your child, but are determined also by the ways in which advice is given. And the manner in which support is provided or offered or procured influences whether the support have positive, neutral, or negative consequences. We can have negative consequences. We can always do harm if we're saying that we're doing one thing, but our intentions as communicated unconsciously to parents are actually saying something different. Now, these two statements there from Davis and Day, from Dunst and Trivette, come from the work of Carl Dunst and colleagues in the US, from Hilton Davis and Crispin Day in the UK, and they come to the same kinds of conclusions. I happen to know the key players in these things, and they are very different characters. So it's very striking to me that they should come to such similar conclusions about that value the importance of how services are delivered. It's also worth noting that the same story plays out at a community level. At the community level, engagement and partnering involve the relationship between a service system and groupings of community members, and the same principles and practices that have shown to be effective in engaging, empowering families at an individual level are also effective at a community level. So we might talk about community-centered practice as paralleling family-centered practice and operating at a group level. So the same relational issues are important. So what we learn from all of this is that human services are relational services, and that human beings are relational beings, and that the quality of those relationships are critical in how effective we are as service providers. So what are the key features then of effective relationships? Let's turn to this critical question. First of all, we need to take on board that relationships have a dual quality or function. They're both a means to an end and an end in themselves. They're a means to an end in the sense that it is through relationships that children and adults learn and develop and change. We are shaped by and changed by relationships throughout our lives. But relationships are also an end in themselves, in that relationships do not just lead to a better quality of life, they are quality of life. The quality of our relationships at any point in time shape our immediate well-being, as well as our capacity to function. So the key features, there's the point again about the means to an end. Having a positive relationship with a parent or parents is a necessary but not sufficient condition. Necessary but not sufficient. It's important to have a good relationship, but having a good relationship doesn't change anything about the way the parent works with the child. You have to do something intentionally and purposefully to build parental capacities to provide children with different experiences if you're going to get any change in child outcomes. And you can translate that into whatever your field is. The same principle applies. You've got to have a relationship, but the relationship is a necessary but not sufficient condition. It's the means through which you change something. So necessary but not sufficient condition for creating change or being an effective helper. The engagement relationship is the medium through which effective learning or change or programs can be delivered. So it's possible to have a very positive relationship with parents and to see them over a long period of time and not do a blind bit of good for their relationship with their kids if you're not changing something about them and the way they relate to the children. But there's a caveat. You can't treat the relationship simply as a means to an end. You can't fake an interest in the parent and their views, because they will know. Research indicates that help receivers are especially able to see through help givers who act as if they care but don't, and help give the impression that help receivers have meaningful choices and decisions when they don't. So this is about the neurobiology. People can see through what we say and do because they're able to detect these messages that we are unconsciously giving off from our facial expressions and tones of voice and postures and so on. So you have to treat the relationship as an end in its own right, while being mindful of the ultimate goal of changing behaviour. I'll say a bit more about that later, but it's a really interesting and skillful balancing act. This is what authentic parent engagement, or authentic engagement of any kind with children or partners or colleagues, means. It means treating the relationship as an end in its own right and being there and present in the moment. So, key features of effective relationship. I won't go into this, but I think relationships have universal properties. I've sometimes referred to it as a psychosocial fractal, a fractal being a recurring pattern that occurs at different levels of scale. What I mean by that is that these characteristics are important in a parent-child relationship, or a professional parent relationship, or a collegiate relationship, or a manager to staff relationship. They all have the same qualities. They all are, the key thing is attunement and engagement, being responsive, being respectful and authentic, clear communication, managing communication breakdowns, being emotionally open, understanding one's own feelings, building empowerment and strength building, limit setting, and building coherent narratives. We don't have time to go into all of that. Could unpack all of those in order to understand it, but I think the evidence indicates that these key features are common to all relationships. So let's get down to some nitty-gritty, the challenges to authentic engagement. What's it like when we're trying to do all of this? We keep in mind the neurobiology and the importance of those unconscious messages that we give off and that parents and others give off back to us. And if we keep in mind the importance of relationships in service provision, and that notion that how services are delivered is important as what is delivered, but that only gets us so far. It's only a means to an end. What then are the challenges in being authentically engaged as a service provider with a service recipient, or any other situation you're in? The first challenge is how to know and manage your own emotions and values. What we have to recognize is there will always be some parents and some situations that we will find hard to understand and accept, and that we'll have a visceral reaction to. In other words, we'll have one of these automatic reactions based upon previous experiences that we cannot control. We can't control it in the sense of we can't not have it. We can control it in the sense of we can manage whether we allow it to affect our behaviour, but we can't stop having the reaction. So understanding our default reactions is partly a matter of being aware of our bodily reactions and what they mean. Part of this neurobiology research tells us that our bodies store up memories and our bodies react. We have anxiety feelings in our guts, or we have a tension that we feel in our neck, or people experience anxiety in all sorts of interesting ways. Some people get tingling in their hands. So our bodies give us messages that they are receiving a signal they're receiving something which reminds them of a situation. So being able to read those reactions in yourself, which are, I'm not comfortable with this person, or this doesn't make any sense to me. It's important, if we are to be authentic and to relate to people in an open fashion, that we understand these reactions. These reactions are part of the unconscious neurobiological processes. It's important to recognize and understand them in order that they will not compromise our response to the personal situation. So it's not a matter of beating ourselves up for having these responses and feeling that they're being judgmental. The important thing is to be aware of them, to acknowledge them, and to make sure that they don't actually interfere with your ability to relate to that person and be helpful to them. Second challenge, how to stay in the moment and manage distracting thoughts. Your mind is perpetually busy. The random thoughts are continuously popping into our minds when we're trying to pay full attention to someone's story or to anything like this presentation. So the question is, how do we manage these thoughts so that they don't interrupt your attunement and responsiveness to the client? Because if you start thinking about the fact that you've only got 10 minutes left and you're worried about where the car's parked and whether you're going to be able to get to pick up your child in time or whatever it is, those thoughts are going to interfere with your ability to tend authentically and in the moment to the needs of the person in front of you, and they will register this at some level. So you need to be able to manage those thoughts. Mindfulness strategies are the way you do that. Mindfulness teaches us about how you register thoughts like that and let them pass through. Don't let them lodge in your mind. Don't let them stay there and dwell on. So you're recognizing that they're there, but you're not allowing them to interfere with your focus. So that's a skill that can be practiced and is an important one. What about maintaining authenticity? That is what genuinely being there in the moment. It's partly about this business of managing distracting thoughts, but it's also about not being, the fact that we can't fake being interested or caring or empathetic. Our real feelings and intentions are being broadcast to other people's brains through subconscious pathways. Therefore, we need to cultivate a genuine interest in people. This is part of being an effective practitioner. You actually have to cultivate being genuinely interested in people, even though you think, oh, well, I've just got to convey this information to them. I don't need to know anything else. You will be more effective in whatever role it is that you've got if you are genuinely interested in people, because that will communicate to them. How do you build parental capabilities? This is part of being having an effective relationship, and using strength-based processes is harder than it looks. Our default approach is to see mistakes in what people do and missed opportunities rather than the positives. So you have to practice looking for the positive things in what children do or in what parents do, wherever it is that you're working with, and identifying them first before you start thinking about the things that they might be able to improve. That's a very important step in a very important skill in learning how to build the capabilities of anyone that you're working with. Another challenge is how not to try and fix every problem. When we give people time and listen attentively, people can often find their own solutions to many of the challenges. And we, as professionals, have a reflex response to sort of try and fix people. And in everyday conversations, you can hear that everywhere. Also, if you talk about some problem that you've got to a friend or colleague, their first response is actually to try and fix it. to think about a way rather than just listening empathetically. And if you want to have a nice illustration of how this, you haven't seen this one, this is a YouTube clip. It's called "It's Not About the Nail." That tells, this is about why you should not always try to fix things, first of all. How do we know if we are engaging parents effectively? I think we've got to get regular feedback. You've got to keep checking with people to say, my job here is to relate to you and to understand your issues. Am I doing that? You need to tell me as a parent, as a whatever, when I'm drifting away from recognizing your concerns and so on. But immediately you tell me that I'm not responding clearly to your story, then I will take that as a cue to switch back. So getting feedback is very important. How do we build genuine partnerships with parents? In order to build genuine partnerships, we need to share information and power. And that, to me, is about trusting the process and the person. I talked before about the importance of belief. You have to believe in the person and you have to believe in the process. So this believing in the person is believing genuinely in the capabilities of this particular person that you're working with, and believing that they have the capability of being able to do something better than they already know how to do it. So, and you also have to trust the process. You have to trust that this process of partnering, of not trying to fix the problem, of being genuine or authentic, will yield results, will in fact be a process that will enable the person to be more effective. Another challenge is how to plan and design services with parents. And here we need to use co-design and co-production strategies to plan and design and deliver and evaluate services. There's a lot we could talk about that. At the ARACY conference, my colleague Paul Pritchard talked about some of the work they've done through the Tasmanian Child and Family Centres, which is exemplary work showing how powerful a co-design, co-production process can be when working with disadvantaged families, and I commend that work to you. How do we develop and maintain skills in engaging parents? This is another challenge. Relationship building skills and practices are trainable. Some people are better at it than others, but everyone can get better at it than they are. If you have appropriate supervision and support, that can also help. But at really getting better at working in relationships with people is something that can continue to develop over a lifetime. And the forms of training that are helpful in building these skills include family partnership training, coaching training, and motivational interviewing, which some of you will know about. It's also important to have regular opportunities for reflection, particularly focusing on and seeking to learn from our imperfections and mistakes. And then there's the business of how to reconcile relationship processes and evidence-based practice. And I'm going to run out of time to talk to you about this. So I will refer you to these papers for more details about this. The first one is a working paper from our Centre towards a model of evidence-informed decision-making. The second is some work we've done for the Department of Human Services, drawing upon that model. I'll just say that evidence-based practice is often interpreted narrowly as selecting from lists of proven intervention, and really it's much broader than that. We should be integrating three sources of evidence: evidence-based programs, evidence-based processes, and client and professional values and beliefs. And evidence-based practice is best understood as a decision-making process that integrates all three of these. And you'll recognise that the client professional values are the beliefs and so on, and the evidence-based processes are the relationship-based issues we've been talking about, and the evidence-based programs are what it is that you deliver. We need a way of bringing them all three together. We've got a model for looking at this, which I'm going to skip right through in the interest of finishing on time and taking some questions. So we'll go straight through to conclusions. Engaging and partnering families and communities are quintessentially relational processes whose success depends upon the nature and quality of the relationships established between all those involved. And without such relationships, there's a much reduced likelihood of our efforts to build parents' capacity to support their children's development and learning being successful. So the relationships are critical to being effective in whatever it is we're doing, engaging parents as in supporting their children's learning or whatever it is. And the process of engaging and partnering is a necessary but not sufficient condition for change. It needs to be complemented by strategies that are evidence-based and that build the capabilities of parents and caregivers to support their children. So engagement and partnering are the medium through which interventions to change behaviour are driven. However, we can't treat engaging and partnering merely as stages to be gone through in order to achieve what we'd like to see. We have to do them authentically for the full take-up to occur. And the skills needed to establish collaborative partnership are well understood and eminently trainable, although not necessarily easy to sustain. And the operation of parallel processes implies that direct service providers will be more likely to engage and partner with families and communities if their managers and others use similar practices. And I've discussed an evidence-informed decision-making framework which tells you how to blend those various decisions. And while everyone agrees that relationships and engagement are important, this doesn't mean that we pay much attention to them. Engagement needs to be approached purposefully, not mindlessly or casually. It's a central feature of being an effective practitioner, paying attention to relationships. And we have to trust the process, have faith that engagement and partnership strategies will be productive, and we also have to trust the person, have faith that the parents have the capacity to be valuable partners and can develop skills and capabilities to support their children's development and learning. So it looks like this. There are outcomes of different forms of learning. If we do things to people, if we direct and control and have a covert agenda to change people as we judge fit, then we may get compliance, we may get resistance, but you'll certainly not get any building of skills or self-reliance. If we do things for people, charitable work with no expectation of a parent doing anything or reciprocating, then we might provide some temporary relief, but we will get no building of skills or self-reliance. If we do things with people, if we partner with them and build relationships with them, then there'll be benefits for the parents. We'll build their confidence and self-reliance, but we mightn't get any change for the children. So we need to think about doing things with and through people. We need to partner with them with a shared agenda to promote child skills and participation. That way we will get benefits for the child and family and create positive environments for all. I have a written up version of this paper for you with all the references necessary for it. It's available on our website at that address, and I'll finish at that point. There's my email address if you wish to contact me, and I'll hand back to Barbara Barker at this point.
Thanks so much, Tim. Fantastic. And you were so on time. I loved the timer going off there. That was great. I don't know about the rest of you, but I thought that was wonderful. There's so much rich information there, and it leaves you really thinking, doesn't it? I know the first time I saw Tim present some of this work at the conference back in June, well, I know that it resonated with a lot of people in our audience, and even with our other keynotes who are now back in their respective towns, back in the US and the UK and Canada, and I know that they're talking about Tim's work as well through their own presentations, again back in their research community. So it's really vital and valuable stuff. Just waiting to see if we have any questions from our panelists today. Anyone that's been listening to the webinar? Okay, we've got a question or two that have come through. Tim, I've got a question here for you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I'm fine.
Okay. I've got a question from Tanya, and she's asking, how much do cultural factors influence the engagement process? Cultural factors.
Yep. Okay. Yes, a good question. From a neurobiological perspective, not at all. Our neurobiology is universal. There will be some shaping of that by cultural factors, but the process that we're describing about fast and slow systems for registering each other's emotional and thought patterns and so on are universal. However, at a conscious level, then cultural factors do play a role. And I think what we do see in some relationships is that in some cultures, there will be a much more differential attitude towards people in authority, which can play into our desire to fix things for parents and to be the expert. So it can be a bit of a snare and a delusion, but nevertheless, we do have to respect the fact that that the person may be wanting us to be expert. We need to start from wherever they're at and see what we can do over time to build a genuine partnership. Yeah, I think I'll leave that. It's a good question, though, and one we could explore at much greater length.
Fantastic. I've got another question here for you. It's from Barbara, and she's asking, not me, this is another Barbara. How do we change practice when no political engagement, when there's no political engagement, I think she's asking. How do we change practice when there's no political engagement? Not sure if does that make sense to you, Tim?
No, I'm not quite sure what.
Okay. We might leave that one if that's not clear. There's another one here.
Yeah.
Can you recommend any research that communicates in the words of parents how they describe or experience being positively engaged? What are the elements of this from their own experience?
I think this is a good question, because a lot of research tends to look at things that go wrong rather than things that go right. I did cite some relevant research, some research that is pertinent to that question, which was the research from vulnerable families, saying, and that's summarising a number of different studies that have gone to the parents themselves and asked specifically, what was it that helped you become better at being a partner, or better at being a parent, or whatever it is that you were, what was it that was helpful and what was unhelpful? So there are some studies, not nearly as many as we would like, and I could certainly, if whoever asked the question would email me, and then I can send you some of those links to some of that kind of work. It is the kind of work we need much more of. We need to be able to put ourselves in the position of the people that we're working with in order to understand their perspective, and to be explicitly and consciously aware of what it is, what it feels like to be in their situation, because that's what the critical relationship aspect of attunement and responsiveness is all about. Unless we can understand what the person is experiencing, what it's like for them, unless they believe that we understand that, then the first crucial step of building a relationship falls down, and we don't really get off the ground. So learning more about what parents think and feel about being recipients of our services is very important.
Thanks, Tim. Someone's written in here and said, parents' perspectives of how the parent-family worker relationship enhances parenting capacity to support children's well-being in families where child neglect is an issue. She's just referring to another piece of research. I think she's saying it's by Elizabeth Reimer, R-E-I-M-E-R. So I think that's a recommendation. She's saying in the next point, this is a great piece of research to refer to, Elizabeth Reimer.
Right.
I think we've probably reached time, but I might just throw in one more piece, question here. We're considering, now she's put FPT. Does that say FPT?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, I'm not sure what that refers to. We're considering FPT for some of our funded providers, most of whom will be unfamiliar with evidence-based practices. Is this the best approach to take with them? The majority will be from Aboriginal organisations.
If we're talking about the difficult issue of, or the issue of evidence-based strategies, and regardless of what population you're working with, then my take on this is that you have to begin with building the relationship first before you start introducing. So the evidence-informed framework, that decision-making framework that I skipped over, describes the logic of why we need to start with relationship building. And if you're working with Aboriginal communities, it is even more important to do that, because they're the ones for whom relationships with service providers have been most problematic over the years. And we must, on all accounts, avoid providing solutions for that, for those communities, without first engaging them in tuning into what their issues are, and finding out what their priorities are, and finding out what they've tried, what works for them, before we bring in what from our perspective, what kinds of strategies are effective. So it's a matter of building the relationship first, and then using that relationship as the medium through which you introduce new potential ways of helping the parent or the community, but also pay attention to the strategies that they already know about. You need to build on what they can do already, and to give them new skills and new strategies to become more competent. I hope that addresses the question.
But Tim, that's wonderful. I think we might wrap up there. I feel like if we keep going, we'll just get more and more questions in. In fact, we have. So I'm going to just put a stop to it there. But please take on notice that if there's any further questions that come in, Tim, we might email them to you, and perhaps then when you respond, we can distribute those responses to the wider audience that we're here today.
Sure, that'll be fine.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks very much again for your presentation. It was so informative and stirred up lots of ideas to consider. A couple of things I'd like to mention. A recording of the webinar and the presentation slides will soon be available online for ARACY members. So if you're not a member, here's a little plug from us to please consider signing up. These lunchtime learning, parent engagement webinars alone will pay for a membership, and there are many other fantastic reasons to join, of course. But if you are interested in the work of the Parent Engagement Network and would like to be a part of it, please visit the ARACY website for more information. We'll send you links in an email this afternoon. The network currently has over 650 members based all over Australia. People like yourselves who are passionate about the importance of parent engagement for improving the learning outcomes of Australia's children and young people. And just a further plug, we have our next newsletter coming out at the end of next week. So that's something to look out for those who are already members of the network. For other ARACY events, please visit our website. So thank you once again to Tim and to all attendees for your time. And thank you very much and have a lovely afternoon.